Sorry, we're running a little late today. Hey, things happen. But um, for those of you that are affected by the PACT Act, please, please, if you have not filed your claims yet, get those claims in real soon. You have just a few more weeks to file so you can have your claim retroactive back to the day the bill was signed into law, which was August 10th of last year. So that's a lot of money for folks. So get those claims in. And also tonight, you know how I've been doing some episodes on what's happening in Hawaii with the Redwater water crisis, and then the Air Force veterans that were stationed out at Nevada nuclear testing range, and how they are being gaslit by the DoD. We're going to continue that on today with some folks from George Air Force Base, the former George Air Force Base, which no longer exists. So let's go ahead and get this show on the road, shall we? All right, everyone. Yes, my name is Tim Hauser. I'm also known as the Gulf War Advocate. And today we're going to continue talking about how service members were contaminated at bases that they were stationed at. And today I am very honored to have Frank Vera on, who was stationed out at George Air Force Base in Southern California, up in the high desert. I was stationed there for 7 years myself. Matter of fact, I pretty much closed that base down. A lot of contamination is going on at that base, and that's what we're going to talk about. So, welcome to the show, Frank.
Hello, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
It's an honor to have you on, sir, and finally get to meet you because we've talked a little bit back and forth over the last couple of years on Facebook Messenger and that, and so it's definitely an honor to finally get to meet you. And when were you stationed out at George Air Force Base?
I was stationed at George 72 to 74. It was my first duty assignment after Lackland Air Force Base Tech School, and it was quite an awakening.
Mm.
Within 3 months of getting there, I started having respiratory problems and uh, stomach problems and rash all over my body, and um, it went downhill from there.
Yeah, yeah. I know that with talking with some members out at the Nevada testing range, they think they know what was the main reason for a lot of the illnesses at George. Do you have any um, clue as to what those contaminants were?
Oh, yes, sir. I've done approximately 600 or 700 FOIA requests, several hundred FOIA appeals, several mandatory declassification reviews, trying to get documents released over the last 30 years. There are several main issues at George. George is one of 130 DoD Superfund sites. That means they're one of the most contaminated parcels of land in the country. We had approximately 100,000 men, women, and children that lived on base, went to school, um, or worked there. Probably another 5,000 uh, civilians. Um, my main issue in the beginning was radioactive contamination because that's what my doctors thought. I had probably 2 dozen or more biopsies, um, including 3 lymph node biopsies, 1 bone marrow biopsy. The doctors at the VA kept saying they didn't know what was going on. 85, I was getting ready for a bone marrow biopsy. And my doctor kept saying, "What did you get? What were you exposed to in the military?" I go, "Well, I have no idea." I told him, I worked on a flight line. After I was injured in the gun shop, they put me on duty restriction, washing parts in hot trichloroethylene in the gun shop, release shop for half a day. And then I went over to the Aegis shop, the small equipment, flight line equipment shop, wash parts there, no safety equipment, no safety monitoring, no safety training. Um, he said, "No, that won't be it." So when I get back to some friend's house that I was kind of staying at because I was pretty much homeless, um, I told them about what the doctor said, Dr. Nasio Hunt at Loma Linda VA. And they said, "Have you seen this newspaper article?" I go, "Oh, no,
Mhm.
I don't get the paper." And it was an article written by William Cooey. It talked about the radioactive waste site at George in the southeast disposal area. So I called him up and I asked him, what he knew about it. And he started asking me, "Well, what did you get into? Why do you think you were exposed to radioactive material there? Where was it?" So he talked to me and I had to, I told him, south of Air Base Road, where I found the barrel in the motocross track. Um, he said, "Describe the barrel." I described it, contents. He says, "You need to come in and meet with me and see what we have." So he brought out what they had. We went out to George, and the the radioactive waste site at that time was fenced off 1985. When I got into it, it was the base recreational area, and that was in 73, summer of 73, and it wasn't marked. Um, it turns out that that radioactive waste site is one of two in the southeast disposal area. Southeast disposal area is the main hazardous, toxic, and radioactive waste site for George. It is 1/4 mile upstream the supply wells for George and Atlanta. Um, and so that started me on my quest to find out what happened and when and where. I got hooked up with Congressman George E. Brown out of Fontana, Democrat, really nice guy. And he was on the environmental committee. And I showed him, the bone marrow biopsy and some of the stuff. And he started fighting for me, trying to get records released and advocating on my behalf. Um, in the meantime, I started requesting records. I got the first record released from it wasn't the Air Force. The Air Force has been really reluctant to release any records.
Mhm.
Um, but I got one of the early reports released, and I got the EPA. Um, well, that wasn't at that time. Got the first report from the Air Force, but it was from another government entity, and it showed the radioactive waste site there in the southeast disposal area. It was a screenshot of that map back there, which is the base master plan. In the southeast corner, or the bottom right hand corner of that map, is they have the radioactive waste site, tetraethyl lead disposal site, munitions residue site. Um, and so I started collecting data, doing FOIA requests, started getting too many documents. So I built a website just for my record keeping. And it just, was all the documents about the radioactive material there. And then in the 90s, early 90s, some of the ladies from the Facebook group for George Air Force Base started contacting me and telling me, "Well, after I was at George, I'm infertile." I go, "Well, what do you mean you're infertile?" Is like the 12th lady. And she goes, "Well, I can conceive, but I miscarriage or stillbirth or, you know." And I go, "Well,
Mhm.
that's not that's not, you're not infertile, you're conceiving, something's interfering with the development of the fetus. So I was working with the Lahontan Water Agency, which is a local water, the state water board for George. And I started talking to the site manager, and I go, well, I'm having all these ladies contacting me telling me they're infertile. I go, all I've been looking at is the radioactive material. I have a completed exposure pathway from the dump sites because they were unlined, unpermitted, you know,
Hmm.
right to the supply wells. She goes, well, there's another issue you need to look at is this organochlorine pesticide in the base housing. I go, okay. so I go into the administrative record, and there's, you know, dozens and dozens of reports, thousands of pages. And I go, this is just over my head. I'm not, takes me a while to gear up. And I go, can you give me cliff notes or, what to look at? So she narrowed it down, and I go, oh, okay, I get it. And so organochlorine pesticides are a persistent organic pollutant, which we now call forever chemicals. And they were used extensively at every single military base
Hmm.
within the continental US that had, you know, built World War II. And it started off DDT, then it went to chlordane, went aldrin, dieldrin, and then a whole slew of other pesticides. And what happens with them, because they're persistent organic pollutants, they don't break down in the environment or the body. They're stored in the fat cell. When the woman gets pregnant, um, the body's trying to uh, feed too. So the body starts
Hmm.
metabolizing fat. And unfortunately, these organochlorine pesticides cross a placental barrier, and they wreak havoc with the developing fetus. The first 12 weeks is critical. If the baby is injured during at that time, it's you're probably going to have an adverse outcome for that child.
Hmm.
Um, and then somewhere along the line, I changed it from my storage facility. I created a website. I tried a couple different content management software. Ended up with a WordPress, and started building out the website, trying to organize it for people. And then next group of people I had all these, because it started getting a lot of traffic from Facebook and some of these other groups. And next group of people was all these little kids started contacting me. Well, they're adults,
Hmm.
but they were stating, well, I was stationed at my dad was stationed at Georgia. My mom was. We lived in on base housing, and my parents didn't smoke. But I developed severe respiratory problems at George, and they ended up with me through my entire adult life. Um, and so I started poking around and trying to figure out what was the cause of that. And that was about when the burn pits were starting to come on scene for the Middle East. And I started reading the documents on them. That I got into the administrative record for George, and I found we had at least several dozen burn pits,
Right.
two incinerators without an air scrubber. The main incinerator was at the hospital, which is right in the middle of the base family housing. Um, so I went back and I checked with the water board people. Then they go, "Well, yeah, you're onto something there." And so I started nailing down the paper trail on that. And then back to the radiation issue. Yeah, I've was on the restoration advisory board for George Air Force Base in the early '90s, and By that time, I had already gone through one CMP exam at Bay Pines VA. Um, I got hooked up with the DOD's and VA's leading Ahmed doctor. He looked through my records. He looked, the little bit of military records that I had, and he, did an oral history. Looked at my medical records from the VA, all the biopsies that I've had, lung X-rays, and he goes, you know, beyond a shadow of a doubt that they knew that you had, they knew or they should have known that you had an acute exposure to radioactive material because I actually breathed the dust in.
Mhm.
Um, and so at the RAB meeting, I kept, asking about, well, was there a hot wash rack at George? Oh, no, no, never anything like that. Were there nukes at George? And they said, well, no, there was never any nukes at George. I go, well, was weapon systems. I worked in the gun shop, release shop, right across the street, right across the drainage ditch from
Yep.
the missile compound. And I know for a fact you had nukes on the interceptor squadrons. Go ahead. Did you, were you saying something?
No, 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 I'm agreeing
Well,
with you 'cause I remember the depot was across the street
yeah.
from the main base.
And so I kept pounding away on the nukes. This is these meetings are covered under CERCLA. You have a moral and legal obligation to make full disclosure of all the known contaminants at the base. Um, I have all these doctors that think that I had a radiation exposure in the military, exposure to radioactive material. Um, and so I ran into a gentleman that was there. He came up to me after one of the meetings, a Dr. John Sable. It turns out he was the Beck for George, base environmental coordinator for George before it was called base Beck. And then he
Mhm.
was Beck for Norton and March. He did a lot of work for the Air Force because he had a JD and he was a civil engineer. And he goes, well, let me see what you have. And so I showed him, the little bit of records that I had. And he goes, oh shit, I am so sorry, Frank. And so then he goes, well, he goes, you don't have much money. I go,
Mm.
no. I go, I'm trying to live on SSI because the VA is not taking care of anything. And so he goes, well, we'll carpool. I go, okay. At first I thought he was, an Air Force colonel or general,
Mhm.
coming to shake me down, and he turned out to be, one of the best people that I know. And so we ended up becoming really good friends. They sent him out at the Southeast Disposal Area in '77. It's his statements on the website.
Mhm.
77 and 78. And they sent him out there with a 9.5-inch auger to do an assessment for the radioactive material. He told me verbally that he found 18 to 20 barrels of an unknown radioactive substance. He ended up developing pancreatic cancer. Um, so we would ride to these uh, RAB meetings, the Restoration Advisory Board meetings, and he'd bring the what we're going to talk about, and
Mhm.
he goes, read through it. He goes, well, what do you see? What do you don't see? And so we discuss it, and then on the way home, he would quiz me, and he flat out told me, he goes, we are not allowed to lie directly to the public, but we can use our superior knowledge of situation and facts to help the public come to the conclusions that we want them to have. And so, in that light, you know, think about what we discussed in the meeting. How are they trying to manipulate the public and the public's perception? And so we we did that for quite a while, several months, and then about the third or fourth meeting in, they pulled Dr. Sable aside and said, "Hey, it was a big blow up meeting," and he said. They said, "You're not allowed to talk to this guy. You're not allowed to share information with him. You're not allowed to drive, let him ride with you to the meetings. You're to cut him off entirely." He goes, they go, "This is getting out of hand." And he told me on the way home, and I go, "Well, I don't want you to get in trouble because you're working for the Air Force. You're running March cleanup." And he goes, "Well, you know, it's at some point you have to do what is right.
Yeah.
Everything is not about money. You have to do the right thing." He goes, "I'm doing the right thing. I'm still working with you." And I go, you have a family. You have to, and you're sick. Um, he goes, he had to damn the torpedoes full speed ahead type attitude.
Yeah.
And so he was the most decorated Beck in the Air Force for coming in there under budget, on time, and they fired him from March. Um, these people are ruthless. Over the years, there's been several dozen people that helped: VA doctors, OSI agents, um, FOIA officers. Um, and when they start helping, they're retaliated against in a big kind of way. They're either transferred, fired, or just driven off. Most of the VA doctors, back to 97 or 95. Um, I was still working with Congressman George E. Brown and Congressman Lewis, uh, Chief of Staff Daryl Hustis at Loma Linda VA, um, Barbara Boxer, Diane Feinstein. Um, Found out because I inhaled the radioactive material. A lot of these are long-lived isotopes,
Hmm.
and your body, when you inhale them, um, they you inhale them, and some expectorate out, go through the GI tract, but the ones that are in the lungs, because they're finely divided, your body thinks it's calcium and it redeposited in the bones. So found out uh, that these long-lived isotopes, they can detect them, decades after the fact. So working with some of the medical staff at Loma Linda VA and everybody, had a referral to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. There's a device that's called a whole body counter. And the Oak Ridge, Tennessee is the most heavily shielded because it was at that time it had been uh, going on 18 years. Um, they go, they just looked at you had, where you had to go to, Oak Ridge,
Hmm.
because they had the most shielding. It's the most sensitive facility. So it was approved by the VA. It was approved by the Department of Energy. It was all done. Um, the VA was just um, uh, getting ready to book the motels and the flight, and then the Department of Defense got in the middle of it and shut it all down. Why'd they shut it down? Because all the isotopes, um, they have a fingerprint, right? So whatever reactor or bomb blast it came from, they have a fingerprint, and they could identify where and when the radioactive material that I got into, uh, where it came from, and so it was shut down. Um, Back up to when I was at George, I worked on the flight line. Everybody had a dosimetry badge. Um, with DITRA, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, I filed a FOIA several years ago for my dosimetry badge and the dosimetry badge for everybody that worked on the flight line, because they wouldn't issue dosimetry badges if there wasn't a reason for it. I asked them to redact the confidential information, just give me the badge number, the results, so that I could show that there was hundreds of people from George that
Mhm.
were issued dosimetry badges. Um, One of the best documents that I've got, or received, well, back to the Restoration Advisory Board, after pushing and pushing on the radioactive material, the Air Force illegally disbanded the RAB that was in 95, 96. They disbanded the RAB. Recently, they just said they want to restart it up. But on the hot wash rack, shit, sorry,
It's okay.
on the hot wash rack, on the hot wash rack, um, sorry about that. On the hot wash rack, the Air Force said it never was there. I had heard from several people that the hot wash rack was there. So
Mhm.
I did FOIA request. I got records showing that the hot wash rack was there. I got released under FOIA. It's on the website. I got I didn't know. I got several, probably a dozen of the atomic blast records released that showed that, hundreds of aircraft that were involved in the atmospheric testing program at Nevada were decontaminated at George.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I remember hearing stories about that when I was stationed there.
yeah, and it's they never cleaned it up under CERCLA. If you Comprehensive Environmental Responsibility Liability Act, the Superfund Act, if you transfer property outside of the federal government, you have to make full disclosure of all the known environmental contaminants that were stored, disposed of, or released there at the site. They haven't done that.
Mhm.
A few years ago, after Volkswagen uh, was sued by the US EPA for falsifying their test results or their smog test, um, Volkswagen recalled, thousands and thousands of cars, and they put a lot of them on George. I contacted Volkswagen USA and said, "Hey, look, that was
Mhm.
the hot wash rack, and it was never really cleaned up. Um, I don't. It's not going to pose a problem to your car, but anybody working on site and the dust particles on the car may cause a problem in the future for you." And it's the the Air Force is lawless. They have no regard for military personnel's health, safety, or well-being, or more importantly, the family members. They treat us like a broken tool when they're done with us. Um, After decades trying to find an attorney to represent just the family, because military people, we can't sue because of the Ferris Doctrine. We have the VA that is supposed to help us.
Mhm.
But we had one of our ladies in the group, Lisa. She found an attorney to represent the children of George and the the spouses of George, and the law firm, uh, the Gomez firm out of San Diego. They spent millions of dollars prepping this case and getting it ready. They filed it. It gets to district court in Northern California, and the judge says, "Well, you can't sue the federal government. For us to allow you to sue for damages is a discretionary function. We are going to deny you the right to seek compensation for the family members' injuries. Um, they don't care about you. No, yeah, no one should
Mhm.
go in the military until they fix it. Um, it's it's just if you're not killed in a war, the VA will kill you, um, and that's not just hyperbole. They withhold evidence, they withhold records. There are 22 veterans a day that commit suicide. Good luck finding any pain management with the VA. Um, Look at the atomic test vets. 100,000 troops were used as guinea pigs in the atomic testing program. And the VA put them under, or the DoD put them under an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. They get into the VA, they can't talk about it, they can't get medical care, they can't get compensation. I had several of my friends that were involved in the open air atmospheric testing,
Mhm.
back in the 90s at Loma Linda, and they were dying horribly. No money, no real medical care, because without the DoD acknowledging what we were exposed to, the VA cannot, or more importantly, will not provide direct medical care for the injuries. I had a friend of mine, Max Hartline, who was the head of the hot wash rack out at Norton. Um, they gave him an environmental suit from the neck on down. He covered everything else. Um, when I met him at the VA, he had cancers all over his head. Um, they replaced his scalp. The VA told him, well, it can't be from the hot wash rack, because that never happened. It was most likely because you played golf. And then after he died, some suits from March came and threatened his wife, OSI
Mhm.
offices. Yeah. They threatened his wife and said that she's not allowed to talk about it at all, because if she talks about it, she will lose her husband's pension. I was on the restoration advisory board for Norton as well as George, and we had gotten the records out of the record repository, National Archives in Riverside, showing the hot wash rack there. So we had invited Max Hartline in, and then Ralph Hernandez, who was a city council member for San Bernardino, and they were going to come in and talk about the hot wash rack. Um, and the Air Force, again at Norton, they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to acknowledge it, and they just wanted to sweep it under the rug.
Mhm.
And it's just a few years ago, I guess it was like 9 or 10 years ago, there was a mine. Um, OSHA had cited the owner of the mine several times over for OSHA, safety violations. The mine collapsed and killed like 12 miners, and the government went after that mine owner for negligent homicide. Um, really, 12 people versus, you have 130 Superfund sites, tens of millions of
Mhm.
men, women, and children lived on these bases. A large portion of them were forced to live on these bases because, face it, military doesn't pay you well.
Right.
If you have a family member, if you have a family, you can't live in town because the rent's so high. So they lived on base. And the government knew about the contamination at these sites for decades. On back to the organochlorine pesticides in 1970, the Air Force almost killed several families at Webb Air Force Base. Um, they had put chloridane down around the perimeter of the house, like they do all of them. All
Mhm.
these directives come out from the DoD, so every base is pretty much the same. They drill holes in the slab and they injected chloridane through. Most of these houses were they called them Cardiff houses. The AC was run in cardboard. So when the houses are built, you have the ground, it's trenched, cardboard is laid out for the ducting.
Mhm.
Then the slab is poured. Well, because they saturated the ground with chloridane, the chloridane leached into the HVAC system. So when the heater came on, the the chloridane aerosolized, went into the air, almost killed the families. It was so bad that they had the National Academy of Science. Sorry, let me pull it up. National Academy of Science do a study, and so 70. So in chlorine, sorry, 1982, they had National Academy 1987, 1979. The Air Force and had the National Academy of Science, which was the gold standard of science, to look at, you know, the hazards associated with chloridane.
Hmm.
And then they finally expanded it out to all the organochlorine pesticides. They came back and said there was no safe level of exposure for family members um, in base housing, because, they're living in there, the kids and the toddlers are crawling around. You have pregnant women. At that point, as soon as the Air Force suspected they had a problem, they had a moral and legal obligation to go out there and do appropriate testing. If the houses came back unsafe, they should have red tagged them, relocated the family members. Did they do that? No. They did a cost benefit analysis, look to see, well, if we can put it off, will we save money by burying it or having it addressed? So they just tried to bury it. Fortunately, it did receive some coverage. In fact, in the New York Times covered it, and they wrote a whole piece on it. And after George closed, they red tagged all the buildings after the fact.
Hmm.
So George closed. They leased the housing to Victorville. Victorville subleased it to the Marine Corps to do training. Um, then the Air Force finds out about it. They go ballistic and say, "Hey, you can't do that." And they said it'll, the soil under, around, and in the buildings is unsafe. Um, so they shut that down. But more importantly, they put deed restrictions on all that property. They said there's no housing, daycare, hospitals. Nobody's supposed to be in there to be exposed to the contamination. Um, uh, Victorville is supposed to have controlled entries around it,
Hmm.
limited, and they're not supposed to allow young girls or women who may are pregnant or get pregnant in there. But they put those concrete barriers up. They put a few signs up. But if you
Yeah.
go online, there are hundreds and hundreds of YouTube videos of kids going in there doing ghost hunts.
Yes.
I mean, they're totally irresponsible. They treat us like I said, like we have no value. Like we're just
Right.
never-ending cannon fodder.
Now, I remember when I was on the base closure team, they took quite a few of us that were in base supply, and we were to inventory everything, try to find new
Right,
homes for all the equipment, basically send them off to other bases and everything.
right,
And some higher ups came into our office one day and sat us all down and says, "All right, we need to figure out what we're going to do with base housing."
right.
And some of the suggestions were, well, bring up the homeless from LA
Yeah,
and let them, live there, be, do some kind of something to help the homeless
yeah,
veterans out. And they said absolutely cannot do that.
no,
And so we asked, so what's going on? They says, well, older base housing is all sealed.
yeah,
That's why you can't hang any pictures up in those houses,
right,
because it's full of asbestos. So we cannot house anybody
yeah,
in those buildings at all.
yeah,
And I says, well, take those houses out. And the guy looked at me and says, you know how much that's going to cost us?
yeah,
I says, but isn't that the right thing to do? And that's pretty much how the meeting ended. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me.
no.
You've been putting us in those houses, but yet
Yeah,
it's no good for nobody else.
yeah. And they didn't even have the decency to notify these people.
Right.
I had hundreds of women call me, you know, crying their eyes out for like an hour, half hour, 45 minutes, because they internalized it, right? You have one, the Air Force was telling them, if you, so they had two standards, right? So if you were an officer's wife or one of the higher echelon, so if they spent a lot of money on you for like a
Hmm.
security clearance or something, if you were in nuke weapons or any crypto, you were a valuable asset, quote unquote. They were telling them if they were a girl not to, or a woman not to get pregnant. Um, the men they were telling to tell your women wife not to get pregnant. But the regular rank and file enlisted people, when they would have these miscarriages, they were telling, oh, it's just one of those things. And these poor women, we have about 200 women and girls that I know of. My group is relatively small. It's under 2,000 people, but they were telling the majority of women and girls from George, if they had a miscarriage, it was much ado about nothing. Miscarriages happen. Um, um, yeah, I mean, it's just monstrous, right? It's just
Hmm.
monstrous. If you got sick, the people that got seriously sick at George, the Air Force, every Air Force base, like George had nukes, March had nukes. March was the big SAC base.
Yes.
You have a radiation safety officer, and he's briefed on all the nukes at the base, all the radioactive material at the base. They know damn good and well what's there, and they would take the people and they're really sick, and they'd send them down to March, and March would say, "Oh, you're allergic to the water. You're allergic to this. You're allergic to that." They would never come back and say what happened.
Hmm.
I ended up down there. I went from 195 pounds down to 134. I had blood coming out of everywhere. And this is in a matter of a couple weeks. I was throwing up blood, coughing up blood, brushed my teeth would bleed, had to pack my nose with Vaseline, peeing out blood, pooping out blood, pus, and mucus. I get down there, they go, "Oh, it's depression." I go, I'm 6'4". Just a couple weeks ago, I was like 195 pounds. I'm 134. This is
Hmm.
not depression. What's going on? Oh no, it's depression. I go, yeah, but it's you, you hear about in the news about the deep state or the swamp. The
Hmm.
swamp starts in the DoD. The DoD is corrupt. I cannot, because George is a pretty typical Superfund site, with the exception of the radioactive material. We had problems with the organochlorine pesticides, um, asbestos, lead-based paint. We had to burn pits.
Hmm.
Um, all these directives on how all these contaminants are supposed to be handled come down from the Department of Defense. They go from the Department of Defense to the Air Force, to the Air Force Command, to the Base Command, and they implement these policies, which are DoD policies.
Hmm.
Um, George is, if anybody wants to look at what really goes on a military base, um, I've tried to document everything. I'm a little dyslexic, kind of burned out my proofreader, my wife, but I try to make,
I got it right down there on the bottom of the screen, folks. Uh, George AFB.info.
yeah,
I
and
tell you
it's
that's some mind blowing reading right there.
yeah, and it's a little complicated because as as I became aware of more and more problems, I branched out back to that base master plan.
Hmm.
So the DoD has two. base plans. One is called a base plan, which is your infrastructure and construction plan. The base master plan is a primary source document that was created by in the Air Force's, you know, you know,
Mhm.
it was created by the Civil Engineering Squadron. The Civil Engineering Squadron was responsible for storing, disposing of, and then later on, the, Congress put them in charge of the entire environmental assessment and remediation program at all these bases. So you have the polluter who created a primary source document, which is a series of plans supposed to
Mhm.
be updated a minimum of every 10 years. There's supposed to be a log file with it. If you go into the Air Force administrative records for all these bases, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of references to this base master plan. There's only one base, because I went through all of them. Air Force Plant 42, it has 100% rating. So if you do a search, a keyword search in the administrative record, it will, rate it by, give you a ranking, right? Only
Mhm.
one base had 100%. So they had the base master plan in there, and then there's a notation that the document was pulled because it's classified, you know.
Oh, man.
And so all these, the US EPA needs to look at this base master plan, the state EPAs, Lahontan, any agency that has oversight of a military installation for the contamination needs to look at it, because these Superfund sites, these are basically crime scenes. Not only
Mhm.
were there dozens of environmental crimes at these bases, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are sick, dying, or dead at these bases because of their direct exposure to the contamination.
Right.
And they need to look at this. They need to look at these things like a crime scene and do due diligence and get your primary source documents. You can't rely on the Air Force, to be honest, because it's run by the Air Force Civil Engineering Squadrons. And they're not going to hang themselves, right?
Right.
They're going to do everything that they can possibly can to muddy the waters or conceal the fact of what went on at these bases. If you look at these like like a lawsuit, right? So you have lawsuits, you have, you know, David and Goliath situations, you have little mom and pop law corporations or attorneys that go up against these mega corporations. Occasionally they win, but more often than not, the corporations use lawfare to bury the smaller firm in paper.
Mhm.
And that's what that's what these cleanup sites are. Because like at George, they spent over $128 million on the environmental assessment, and they really haven't cleaned up much. They're into natural attenuation now. Well, they said, well, we'll just the contamination's so bad, we'll just let it degrade over time. Dilution is a solution to pollution. And
Mhm.
the ATSDR, they were they were they were created for the express purpose of documenting these completed exposure pathways at these various Superfund DoD Superfund sites. For, from the contaminants to the base personnel. That was what their charter originally was. And if you go into the public health assessments that they have published, they just ask the Air Force or the Navy or the Department of, Defense or Army, you know, what documents should we review? Well, of course, they're going to give you
Mhm.
worthless documents.
Right.
So,
Now, I remember, well, most of the base during Desert Storm went to Bahrain. I got sent off to, Dhahran, Saudi Arabia,
right,
and the rest of the base came back way before I did.
right.
Matter of fact, I went a lot later after, and when I came back, I noticed that a lot of my friends and troops and stuff, they and their spouses, they were having babies,
Yep,
and it seemed there was something wrong with every single baby that was born
yep,
when I came back from the war. Um, Now I didn't know about how contaminated George Air Force Base was,
right.
so I figured it was everything we were exposed to during the war that was causing that. And it, but what was happening caused me to make a moral decision on my own and decided not to have any kids of my own.
Right.
Um, Now, several years ago, one of my old troops, Karen Strishak, she contacted me and says, "Hey, did you know how bad things were at George Air Force Base?" I said, "No, I said I know there was a bad joke going around telling women not to drink the water, um, but I was pretty much clueless about the contamination there, and so she started telling me, and then she hooked me up with your site on Facebook, and I was like, man, we at George, we got the double whammy. Not only did we get contaminated and poisoned during the war, but we were actually living in a cesspool of toxins."
Yeah,
And a group that I'm advocating for out in Nevada, Air Force veterans, they all were stationed out at the Nevada Nuclear Testing Range, and the DoD has them what's called data mask. So
right.
if they apply for benefits at the VA, they're getting denied
Yeah,
even access to basic medical care because the DoD is going to say these people never existed. They never worked
yeah,
for us.
yeah,
But yet that's where they did all the nuke testing way back in the day.
right.
They believe they have documentation showing that when they were cleaning up after those tests, that they took a lot of that contaminated soil and a lot of the nuclear waste from those tests and they buried it at George Air Force Base.
Yeah. It anything is possible. I've so if anybody's interested in doing some heavy duty digging at the base that they're looking at, um, you have to seek out primary source documents. Where you always start, or you try to start, is aerial photos. At the University of Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara, they have the largest collection of aerial photos in the country. And the vast majority of them, you can download them for free. Um, and you can see when sites were active. You can see, when places were built. Um, yeah, it's well worth your time. Uh, it's free. If you have a little bit of time, the only thing you're spending is time in
Yeah.
disk space, but in
Mhm.
bandwidth. But that's doable.
Now, if anybody's out there uh, looking into researching if their base is a super site or not, not sure how to go about doing this, contact us at support@veteransassurance.org. Matter of fact, that's the organization that presents this podcast. Leave your name, your email address. Tell us what you're interested in doing as far as the base that you were stationed at, and I can get with Frank. I can get with some other people. We can get you started on the right path on researching if your base is a super fun site or if there was contamination at that base. And it's time the DoD fesses up to what they've done to us.
Yeah,
Um, Not only George Air Force Base. Camp Lejeune, which is lucky to get into the PACT Act. So those people are going to get some compensation for the illnesses that they've uh, got while stationed at Camp Lejeune. But what's going on right now, too, I don't know if you know this, Frank, um, at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam in Hawaii,
Right.
there's a fuel facility called Red Hill Fuel Depot, and it's underground, and it was built right on top of the base water supply, the groundwater that they
Right.
use, and it's had some very massive leaks, and it's estimated that 98,000 men, women, children are sick due to this exposure.
Right.
It was all jet fuel and it leaked into their water. Matter of fact, I know you've seen videos of where people live near fracking sites where oil companies frack for oil, and they turn on their faucet and they can set it on fire. Red Hill puts that to shame.
Yeah.
The, it, there's videos where a lady fills up her tub and she lets it sit for 5 minutes. All the jet fuel rises to the top.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing that the Navy came out and stated, yeah, this happened, but yet they're not taking care of the people.
No. And they wonder why their recruiting goals are not being met.
Right.
You know, you can spend billions of dollars in advertising, but the truth gets out there. And if the men, women, and children of the United States see that you abuse your charges, you know, what the heck? You
Yeah.
know, you don't understand why people don't want to enlist. You know, man up, right?
Right.
Grow a backbone, man up, and do the right thing. If you have to, if I firmly believe people need to go to jail over this, uh, prison.
Mm-hmm.
Leavenworth, um, there need to be court-martialed. If they're still in the military, court-martial them. If they're not in the military, there's no statute of limitations on homicide. Negligent homicide is a homicide, um, and then wrongful reckless endangerment is a charge
Yeah.
they can be charged with because they knew the problem existed. They concealed it. They allowed people to be needlessly exposed, harmed them, or killed that resulted in their death. Clean up, clean up your mess. You have a problem internally. You really need to address the rot that is within the DoD.
Mm-hmm. 100%.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, folks. This is going to be a continuing story. We got the three groups now. I know it's going to get even bigger. Frank, if you can hang on here after we go off the air, I want to bring something across, an idea across to you here,
Sure.
and
All right.
everyone that follows us all the time, they know that I had a brother, Dennis, who was a Vietnam Gulf War veteran who took his own life 22 years ago this past Christmas Eve. So, people, 988, then press 1. You are guaranteed to speak to a counselor. No more voicemails, no more messages, nobody calling you back. You'll get a human being on the first try. All right. They're not going to place you on hold unless you ask them to, or they say, hey, we need to look up something for you. They're going to talk to you. Guaranteed. And also, I mentioned this earlier. This program is presented by Veterans Insurance Network. It's a new nonprofit out there. They're forming a network of smaller nonprofits that veterans don't know about, so the veterans can get the care that and aid that they need. So contact Veterans Insurance Network. Say, hey, look, this is my problem. I don't know who to turn to. We'll help you get in contact with the people you do need to get in contact with, and we will stay with you until they say they can help you. Um, Frank, it's been an absolute honor, sir. I have talked with you a few times on Facebook Messenger, and what we talk about has always blown me away. You are one extreme, what I call how to put this, one extreme researcher.
Uh, Thank you.
The research you have done is going to help a lot of people.
Well, we have close to 200 people that have won their impossible VA claims, and it's not just me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a team effort. There's a lot of people that help, that do help. Um, I'm working with a reporter now. She went to a National Archives in D.C. and she found that there were chemical weapons there. And well, when it was an Army base,
Mm-hmm.
the Air Force has not disclosed that. I got permission to send it off and post it to the Facebook group. I sent it off to the water board to have them look at it. Why would you have chemical weapons at a base that's what, 200 miles inland?
Yeah.
They're for using against people.
Right.
The only people that were on the base were Americans. I can't.
Right.
But it is a team effort.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people that help, and I am eternally grateful for all the government employees that have helped, that have cost them everything, and the veterans and family members that help.
Yes. All right, folks. The website is georgeafb.info. And I tell you what, be prepared because there's a lot of information on that website. And not only is George Air Force Base a super fun site, but the Nevada nuclear testing range, that's a super fun site, even though the DOD is tell you that base doesn't exist. There are other bases too, not just Camp Lejeune and George Air Force Base. I believe Shaw is one of them. Um, uh, if you're not sure, Google it. If you can't find it on Google, contact me and we will find out for you. If I can't find it, I know Frank will be able to help me. So, people, if now's the time, we need everybody involved. Call your senators, call your congressmen. You have two senators and one congressman
Yes.
where you reside. Call them. Tell them, say, hey, look, enough's enough. The contamination of military personnel and veterans and their families has got to end. The DOD needs to finally come clean on this. These people need help and they need it now.
They do.
Needed it a long time ago, actually. Um, so once you're done calling your senators and your congressmen, call all the congressmen in your state, call senators in other states as well. You can call them. Now, the only ones you can contact by email are your senators and your congressmen because they verify your address, and that's the only way you're going to get an email to them is if you're actually one of their constituents. But you can call any congressman, you can call any senator. Matter of fact, even email the White House. I do. I get replies back from President Biden, personal emails back from him. So he's on our side on this. So, people, we need everybody to start getting involved. If you're too afraid to get involved, then hey, you don't have to tell them your name.
And
Just call and leave a message. If they don't answer, leave a message saying, "Hey, it's time for the DOD to fess up to what they did and take care of these people." So once again, Frank, thank you so very much, sir. I know this is going to reach a lot of people. We're going to get a lot of good response from this, and Hope you can enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right. Thank you.
All right. See you next week, folks.